Alright, so welcome back to another video. So we're going to go ahead and talk about dynamic routes, and we're going to use a function called getStaticPaths to implement dynamic routes. Okay, so what exactly are dynamic routes? Well, let's say, for example, let's go back to this popular page that we created earlier in our routing episode, one of the first episodes. So let's go back to /blogs/popular. And you're going to see that it gives us back popular blogs page. Okay, now inside this popular folder, we have this file that has this square bracket id.tsx. Okay, and when we create a file that has square brackets, and then inside the square brackets, we pass in like a variable name like id or title or whatever, right? This is called a dynamic route. Okay, so what that means is we can actually pass in values treating that ID, in this case the ID, as an actual route parameter. So if you're familiar with route parameters, they're basically a way to retrieve a specific resource based on the domain that you're trying to fetch it for. So for example, a common tactic that many applications use is if you're building, like let's say for example you're building a blog application, right? And you want to get a single individual blog post based off of the ID. You might have a dynamic route such as like /blog/123, and when you visit that route, it should give you back the blog post based off of the ID that is 123, right? So you can think of that 123 value as like some kind of route parameter, like the blog post ID. Okay, so on the API, it would search for the blog post based off of that ID in the database, and it will return it back to you, and then you can render it on the front end. Okay, so we can use dynamic routes to literally render individual resources based off of parameters. Okay, so for example, if I pass in 123, this should give me the blog post that has an ID of 123. Okay, now the tricky part is with route parameters, especially since we are using, or at least in the last episode, we used the getStaticProps function. Okay, and what that did was we used this to fetch our data, and then we loaded that data into our component, and then we rendered all of those posts. So if we go back to that page, you can see that I have post 1, post 2, and post 3 being rendered. Now, what if I wanted to make it so that I can visit each one of these individual posts based off of their IDs, right? So for example, post 1, we have this post 1 is mapped by its ID of 1. So if I were to visit /blogs/1, I want to be able to see post 1 and all of its content, right? I don't want to just render all the posts on one single page. I want to be able to have each post mapped with its own dedicated route. Now you might say, okay, well, can't I just, hard code some routes and, render that specific blog post? Well, you could, but if your application is large, like if you have, thousands and thousands of blogs, sometimes you can't just, hard code those routes, okay? And what you need to do is you need to go ahead and predefine those routes, and we're going to do that in this video. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that if we go ahead and add, let's say 1, 2, or 3 as the route parameter, it's going to give us back the individual post. Not all the posts, just one single post. And fortunately for our JSON server that we're using to fetch fake data, we can actually pass in a route parameter like /1 to get the individual post, which is nice. And this example is going to translate into like an actual real example. So when you build your own applications where you have, a whole bunch of resources and you want to get just an individual resource of that specific domain, it'll translate very well. So what we're going to do is similar to what we did with the popular folder. We created this dynamic route with the ID variable, right? We're going to do the same thing with this blogs page. So I'm going to create a new file called square bracket ID and then .tsx. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a simple component to show you what happens or what it looks like when we render it. Now let me go ahead and export this as a default export. So now if I go to /blogs/1, it's going to give me blog post. Now right now, if I add whatever value I want, it's going to give us blog posts. Nothing's going to really happen. Okay, but we want it to actually give us back a single blog post based off of whatever value we pass in as this route parameter. So if I were to pass in 1, 2, 3, what should happen is it should take this 1, 2, 3, treat it as the blog post ID. It should look up either in our own database or some external API, or if you're fetching it from your own content management system, it should look for the blog post based off of that ID of 1, 2, 3, and then it should fetch it. And then we should render it to the user. Okay. So in our case, if we were to actually go to this JSON web server, you can see that this JSON web server gives us back an array, and it gives us 3 posts, and each one of these posts are mapped by an ID. So when I visit in our own application, when I visit /blog/1, it should only show us this post. If I go to /blog/2, it should only give us this post. And if I had more posts, it would give us the individual corresponding post based off of the value of that ID. Okay, and you can also call this this whatever you want, right? If you wanted to call this, let's say, post ID, you can literally call it whatever you want. Now, what we're going to do is inside this ID, inside this dynamic page over here for our dynamic route, we're going to need to actually use getStaticProps as well as getStaticPaths. Okay, so if you try to use getStaticPaths alone, it's going to throw an error because you need to use both getStaticPaths with getStaticProps, and I'll explain the responsibility of both of these functions when they're worked together. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you. So let me go ahead and export getStaticPaths first. And you're going to see that this function, all this function is supposed to do is just return an object. And this object is supposed to have the paths property as well as a property called fallback. Okay, now this paths property is literally just going to be an array of objects. And this array of objects is going to have, each object is going to have the params property. And this param is going to map to an object. And we want to use the same route, the same route parameter name. So we call it ID. So I'm going to name it ID. And for now, I'm just going to hard code the ID just to show you what it looks like. Now, if I go into our app, it's going to throw an error because it's saying getStaticPaths was added without a getStaticProps. So we need to make sure we have getStaticProps as well. And remember, getStaticProps is called during build time, but since we're in dev mode, it's going to call every single time whenever we, save. Okay, so let's just go ahead for now. Let's just return just a hard-coded empty object, just so that we can see what happens. So if I have fallback set to false, it's just going to go ahead and give us a 404, and it makes sense because if I try to go ahead and go to /1, you can see that inside this paths array, we don't have a route defined for 1, right? Whatever you pass in as these objects are going to define the routes ahead of time. Okay, so when you actually build your Next.js app, Next.js is going to call getStaticPaths, and it's going to generate all of those paths, so that way your application will know what paths are mapped, and then it will go ahead and allow the users to visit those paths. So if I wanted to visit /123, I could, and you're going to see that it just gives us back this blog post component. We're not doing anything yet with the props, okay? But if I go to /124, it's going to return a 404. And the reason why it's returning a 404 is because we have fallback set to true or fallback set to false. If we set this to true, it's not going to give us a 404. I'm just going to set it to false, okay? Just so that we can at least see what's going on when we don't have routes being registered. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and fetch this JSON server, because what we want to do, right, and this is what you're actually going to do in real applications, you're going to fetch your content management system, you're going to fetch your database for all of your records, right? And you're going to go ahead and take all those records, which is usually an array, and you're going to transform the array of records, right? Whatever it is, it could be blog posts, it could be users, it could be Discord servers, right? The information for Discord servers. It can be whatever, right? And you basically want to use a unique value and use that to represent the route parameter that the user is going to pass in to visit that specific resource. So, for example, if we're dealing with users and we want to have user routes based off of the user ID. So, for example, if I had instead of blogs, it was just /users/123. So the user ID of 123 would have to give us back all of the user data where the user's ID is 123. Right? So we would fetch all the users, and then we would take the ID, and then we would use the ID to generate the paths. Okay? So let me explain a little bit more on how that's going to work. So let's first just fetch this posts endpoint. So we're going to do the same thing that we did in the previous episode where we fetched this JSON web server or this JSON server for data. So let me go ahead and import Axios again. So await Axios.get, pass in the URL. All right. And this is just going to be an array of posts. And what I'm going to do is I want to type annotate this. So let me go ahead and copy this custom type that I created. And I'll put this up here just so that I can type annotate this. Okay. So inside getStaticPaths, we want to fetch all of the resources. Every single one. Even if it means you're fetching like 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 100,000 records, right? Because remember, this function is only going to be called one time during the build phase. And that's okay typically because, you really will only be building whenever you're ready to redeploy. So if you're only going to build your app for deployment, once a week or once every month or so, right? It's just going to be one expensive call, and that's going to be okay, right? So if you're going to, even if your database returns like 1,000 records, that's fine because it's going to take those 1,000 records and it's going to generate 1,000 paths, 1,000 dynamic paths. Okay, so and when the user accesses those paths, it's just going to have HTML that's already generated and served to the user, and it's going to load up ridiculously fast, and it's going to be SEO optimized, it's going to be ranked higher, and web crawlers will be able to index it properly. Okay, compared to just regular client-side rendered components or client-side rendered HTML. Anyways, so let's take this posts, and what we're going to do, so instead of having these hard-coded paths, what we're going to do is let's first create a variable called paths. Let's reference posts, and we're going to call the map function. And we're going to take each post, and we're going to return a new object. And the object that we're going to return is going to have this params property. And inside params, we're going to have the ID property. Now, this ID property has to be a string, or else it's going to throw an error. Right now, it's a number. I could actually just change this to a string, and it'll be fine. It should properly convert the type. And I can just destructure ID, because this is just an array of posts, okay? Or an array of blog posts, and the blog post has ID, okay? So literally, it just returns an array of paths, which literally matches the structure. Okay, so if we console log paths, and let's go ahead and refresh the page, and let's go into, whoops. Let me see. Oh, okay. It seems like it doesn't want to console log it for me. Oh, wait. I'm sorry. We're on users. Whoops. Okay. So if I go into my console, you're going to see that I have this array of paths. And you can see that it gives me all of these objects. And each object has a property called params. And it has the ID. So we have 1, 2, and 3. And notice that these IDs correspond to the post IDs, and which we're using to represent each unique blog post. Okay, so let's go ahead and replace 1, 2, 3, or I'm sorry, replace this hard-coded array with our properly mapped paths. Okay, and now if I refresh, you're gonna see that right now, when I fetch, or when I visit this /blogs/1 route, it's going to actually work. But the problem here is that we're not doing anything. We're not doing anything with this ID. Okay, so we actually need to go into, or actually, wait, what's going on? What's that provides a string? Okay, actually, it seems like we actually can't just pass. We actually can't just change this type as an ID, or we can't change the type to string and have it work because it's still technically a number because from the API it's a number. So let me change this back to a type of number, and I'll cast it, or not cast, but I'll convert it by calling toString. Okay, there we go. Yeah, that's a lot better. Okay, there we go. So now it actually works. Okay, now we're not done yet because we still need to obviously render out the individual blog post. Right? We haven't done anything yet. Now here's a nice part about how getStaticProps and getStaticPaths work together. So remember, when you use getStaticPaths, you must use getStaticProps. But you can use getStaticProps alone. And if you use it alone, you typically are really using it without dynamic routes. Okay? So since we're using dynamic routes, though, these two functions work well together. So what happens here is the getStaticProps function actually takes in an argument called context, and the type is actually the static. Let me actually get this static. It's actually a type of getStaticPaths context. Okay. Now, if I console log this context, I want to show you what is being logged real quick. So I refresh. You're going to see that it gives us this object, and this object has this params object inside, or this params property, which is an object. And guess what? This params property, right, it maps to this object. And guess what this object has? It has the ID for the individual resource, which is the blog post. Okay, so what we want to do inside getStaticProps, okay, because remember, getStaticPaths is used for generating the paths, right? Inside getStaticProps, we're actually going to go ahead and fetch the individual resource itself. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take the params. We're going to actually get the ID. So let me go and do const. Let me see, const ID equals context.params.id. Now it's going to complain. It's going to say that it's possibly, what's going on here? Let's see what's going on. Oh, sorry about that. It should be getStaticProps. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I used the wrong type. It should be getStaticProps. Okay, so it's going to say params is possibly undefined. So for now, I'm just going to type assert this. Okay, so we'll get the ID. And then what we want to do is we want to fetch the individual resource from the API. Okay, so if you're building your own API, you want to make sure you have an endpoint that gives you all of the records, so you can generate the dynamic paths. And then you want to have another endpoint that gives you the individual record based off of the route parameter that you're using. So since we're using IDs, we would obviously pass in the ID to get the individual resource. Okay, if you use title, then you'd have to obviously fetch by the title. So we can actually just pass in the ID. I'm going to get rid of these. I'm going to give the single quote and change it to a template string. Okay, so and it's not going to be a type of blog post anymore, or blog post array. It's just going to be a single blog post. So it's not going to be an array of blog posts, just a single blog post. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and instead of returning an empty object for props, we'll just return post. Okay, and now we can go inside the next page, or let's first create another type called blog post props, and we'll type annotate post to be a type of blog post, and then we'll pass this inside the angle brackets for next page, and then we can go ahead and destructure post, and watch this. I'm going to go ahead and render out post.title and then post.id. Let's see what's going on. There we go. So now you're going to see that when I refresh, it gives me post number 1 and then the ID. So post 1 is the title. If I go to /blog/2, it's going to give me post number 2. Okay, and if I go to /blog/3, it'll give me post number 3. If I go to /blog/4, it's actually just going to give us a 404. And the reason why is because the API does not have that resource. Okay, so that's pretty much it when it comes to static site generation using getStaticProps as well as getStaticPaths. I know it might be a little bit confusing, but try to try your best to really understand that these two functions work together, and you're going to use them when you want static site generation for your application. And these functions are only going to be called during build time. The reason why they're being called every single time right now is because we're in development mode, and that's the default behavior. But when you're ready to deploy your application, these functions are only going to be called one time when you build your application. So every single time you run the build script, it's going to call these functions. It's going to fetch all the resources, generate all the dynamic paths, okay? And then it's going to fetch all the individual data, and then populate that HTML template with that data, and then it's going to serve it back to the client as a single HTML document. Okay, so hopefully this tutorial made sense. And in the next episode, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the get server-side props function, which is where we're going to look into server-side rendering. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Peace out.